To finish up the topic we were talking about the inyan of whether you could be mispalel, that somebody should do tshuva, and the question is whether that is an interference with the free will that the person has, and Hashem normally does not interfere with free will. So we had mentioned the Gemara by Rabbi Meir and Bruria, where Bruria told Rabbi Meir, who wanted to pray that Hashem should kill the Rishayim, and Bruria said, you should pray that they do tshuva. And the Marsha asks the Kasha, how can you pray that they do tshuva? Isn't that hakol b'dei shemayim chutz miyiras shemayim? Everything is in the hands of heaven, except for the decision to serve Hashem. Excuse me. So whether they do tshuva is up to them, it's not up to God. I think I may have mentioned before, I don't remember, that when we used to come back in Ner Yisrael, at the beginning of a Zman, and we would give Shalom Aleichem to the Rosh Yeshiva, Rav Ruderman, Zechreino Livracha. So he would always say to us, are you going to learn well this Zman? Are you going to learn well this Zman? So we would give the from Yeshiva Bachar answer, Im Yirtzeh Hashem, we will learn well. And he would say, that's not the right answer. Of course Hashem wants you to learn well. It's not if Hashem wants me to learn well. If you want to learn well, you'll learn well. Because if you want to learn well, Hashem already wants you to learn well. So you shouldn't say, Im Yirtzeh Hashem, you should say, if I want, I'll learn well. It sounds a little chutzpahdik. Will you learn well? If I want to, I will. Okay, but be as it may, that would be the correct answer. Now, it is interesting, though. I had mentioned the teretz Rabbi Yoshev gave, which I thought of as well, but it's a very, very logical teretz, that you're not praying that Hashem should make somebody righteous. That's their decision, but that Hashem should put into their lives the people and the experiences that will be ma'orer them to do tshuva. Meaning to say, the final decision is going to be their decision. But Hashem certainly orchestrates the different events that happen to us in the course of our lives, and indeed, it's a very big mystery. It is a big mystery, which I don't think any of us fully understand. Why do some people get those experiences, and some people don't? See, it's not just a matter of bechira. To have a controlled experiment in bechira, you'd have to have two people who are given the identical inspiration. One person takes it, one person doesn't. So we'll chalk that up to bechira. But if the pshat is one person gets certain experiences and the other person didn't, you can't really say that one person is better than the other person. I didn't have those experiences. That's a big mystery. Rav Schiller once said many years ago, for some reason they don't like this in Lakewood, I don't know why, that this could be the kayach of the tefillas of your great bubbies and zaydis years ago, right? It's an old minhag Yisrael that at the time of candle lighting, the woman who lights the candles, or a man, if a man is lighting candles, is mispalel, that they should have children and grandchildren who are righteous and the like. And those tefillas can go across many, 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 many generations. So maybe the guy who met the right person at the kaisel, or the right campus rabbi, or whatever it is, that might be Hashem answering the prayers of a bubby, a great bubby, hundreds and hundreds of years ago. And even if her prayer was not answered for the intervening generations, maybe her own children were not religious, or her own grandchildren were not religious, but the tefillah might work hundreds of years later. As I say, for some reason, never mind. Okay, the people in Lakewood don't like that word. I don't know. I really don't know why, but I don't say it anymore because they don't like it. But okay, but I'll say it to you. And this really fits Rabbi Yoshev's explanation that even though you can't pray directly that my grandchild should be from, but I can pray that they be exposed to the experiences that will bring them in the right way, because that is really one of the great mysteries of life. It is truly a mystery why some people get those experiences and some people don't, and it's not necessarily any merit that the person has. So it may be connected to zuchas. Your merit is how you choose to respond to those experiences. That is your zuchas. For sure, that's your zuchas and that's your bechira. But the fact that you get the experiences is a bit of a mystery. But be it as it may, This is how Rebbe Yashiv understands how he answers the Marsha's Kasha. The Chazon Ish, as I indicated, actually seems to say something even more dramatic, that you can directly be mispalel, that Hashem should override somebody's bechira and bring him to the right place. Now that's what the Chazon Ish seems to say, but just to be intellectually honest, Rebbe Yashiv argues, not only does he say his teretz on his own, but he says he feels that's what the Chazon Ish means as well. So even though many people will say that the Chazon Ish says tefillah can directly override bechira, Rebbe Yashiv interprets the Chazon Ish to mean the same thing that he said, that you're only mispalel for the experiences. So now let me share with you a Gemara in Makos in which this issue will come up again. Everybody knows the Parsha of Ir Miklat. In fact, we read it the week before last, and it's a few places in the Torah, that if somebody kills b'shogeg, if somebody kills accidentally, but usually carelessness, not an accident, but a careless accident, manslaughter we would call it, so he does not get the death penalty because he was a shogeg, but instead he must go to the city of refuge, what's called the Ir Miklat. And there actually were 48 cities of Orei Miklat. These are the 48 cities that Leviim live. That every Levite city is also an Ir Miklat. Like the Lubavitcher Rebbe has a whole harichas. There's an interesting discussion that in the Torah there does not seem to be a prison system. We don't really have jail. Jail is not one of the punishments. The Torah does mention jail, but that's always a holding cell. When Moshe didn't know what to do to the guy who gathered wood, so he was put in a prison or a jail cell until Moshe figured it out. So the only reference, other than Paro, but in terms of Klal Yisrael, the only reference to jail is as a temporary holding cell until we know what the punishment is. But imprisonment itself, incarceration, is not one of the punishments of the Torah. The closest we have to some type of arrest is Ir Miklat. Now, Ir Miklat is not really in jail. I mean, you have a whole city. I mean, you're living in a city. This is a regular city. It'll have a pizza place and everything else. But you are under city arrest. You're not allowed to leave the city. And if you leave the Ir Miklat, the Goel Hadam, the relative of the victim of the murder, is allowed, and some say even as a mitzvah, to kill you. And technically, your safe zone is not just the Ir Miklat, but you have a techum. You have 2,000 amos around the Ir Miklat in which you're still safe. So you can actually go for a walk outside of the city up to the techum. But if you take one step beyond that techum, he could shoot you at that point, and you are vulnerable. So you can imagine that if the Goel Hadams are so inclined, they might be, sitting outside the Ir Miklat, waiting for the Rotzayach, to make a bad move, or whatever it would be. Again, the institution of Goel Hadam is a little hard for us to understand. It seems to be advocating kind of a vigilanteism, kind of a revenge type of thing. Okay, I'm not going to talk about that now. It is a good question, but that's not our topic. But the interesting thing that is connected to our topic is that the Rotseach remains in the Ir Miklat a very strange duration of time until the Kohen Gadol dies. Now, that's a very strange sentence. If the Kohen Gadol dies a day after he goes to the Ir Miklat, he goes home after a day. If the Kohen Gadol lives for another 50 years, he stays in the Ir Miklat for 50 years. If he dies first before the Kohen Gadol, his body is buried in the Ir Miklat to be exhumed to the family cemetery only after the Kohen Gadol dies. Very strange. Could be a long sentence, could be a short sentence. He might die in the Ir Miklat. And there are many halachas. Those of you that learned Maseches Makos, either the Gemara or even the Mishnah, know that very, very interesting halacha, that if a Talmud of a yeshiva kills somebody b'shogeg and has to go to the Ir Miklat, the whole yeshiva and the Rebbe has to go with him, but they don't have to stay overnight. They can go home at night. But for the Seder of the yeshiva, the whole yeshiva is moved for one Talmud, and that is because the Torah says an Yer Miklat is made so the Rotzeach shall live in the Yer Miklat. What type of life do you have without your Rebbe, without your Torah, without your yeshiva? So in order to enable the Rotzeach to live in the Yer Miklat, the whole yeshiva moves. But again, understand that they do go home at night, and they can have off Shabbases. They don't live in the Yer Miklat, but the yeshiva essentially is relocated into the Yer Miklat. And there are many technical discussions. What if a Levi kills who already lives in a Yer Miklat, so he has to go to another city? There are different rules about how that works. And but Lubavitcher Rebbe made the interesting point that you see that this is the closest analog to a prison system in the whole Torah. But it's interesting that the people, who do you put the Rotzeach with? You put the Rotzeach with the most righteous element of Klal Yisrael, the Levium. The Levium are the teachers. The Levium are the Talmidei Chachamim. Meaning if somebody was careless, somebody was callous, somebody didn't care enough. Because again, remember, this is very important. Yer Miklat is not for accidents. Real accidents are called onus. They're not called shogeg. And they don't go to the Yer Miklat. Yer Miklat is for people who were careless. I went through a red light. I didn't look both ways at an intersection. I threw a metal object out of my window, not looking to see if somebody was there. Carelessness, meaning there is a certain sinfulness in the fact that you didn't care enough to be careful, and that's why you need the atonement. Right? You understand this? Yer Miklat, people make a mistake. They think the purpose of Yer Miklat is to protect me from the Rotzeach, from the Goel Adam. That's true, but it's not only protection. It is punishment for purposes of kapara. That's why, for example, let's imagine you're a rich guy. I mean, you understand this. If Yer Miklat is only about protection, well, let's say I'm a rich guy, I got a mansion, I can hire my private security guard. So when the Beis Din tells me, go to the Yer Miklat, you need to be protected, I say, I'd rather stay at home, I'm more comfortable. And I got guards. Can a Rotzeach say that? No, because the Yer Miklat is not only about protection. The Yer Miklat is an onesh that the Torah puts on the Rotzeach for purposes of kapara. Okay, that's a very important point. It's not just about protection. So what do we tell a person who needs kapara because you were careless, you didn't look both ways, you went through a red light, you didn't look out your window who was playing in the yard? We don't send him to a place that is filled with bad criminals. We send him to a place. Yes, there'll be other Rotzchim there, but the dominant population are tzaddikim, Talmidei Chachamim. You put a person in an environment that'll bring him to tshuva, that will bring him to a good place, as opposed to the prison system that we have, right? So some kid goes to prison, let's say, because he had some marijuana. Okay, I know marijuana is being legalized in different places, but whatever it is. So it's a minor little thing. He had a marijuana cigarette. He got caught by the police. So you put him in a place that's filled with rapists and child molesters. And a person is influenced by his environment, right? So what influences a person in a prison setting? He becomes like the people he's with. And that is why there is a huge problem that is called recidivism. Recidivism means once you've been in prison once, you're going to keep on going back and back and back and back and back and back, because that's what you learn, right? And yet the prison philosophy of the Torah is that if we're going to limit a person in terms of his mobility, we will try to put him in an environment of holiness and kedusha. By the way, that actually was the original idea of even prison from a secular perspective, but it's been long discarded, and that is one of the terms for a prison is penitentiary. A penitentiary comes from the word penitence, which is a word for tshuva. That the notion is we're going to throw you in isolation so you can contemplate your actions and turn to God. Usually it doesn't happen. Sometimes it does happen. Some people do have spiritual transformations in prison. It does happen. I'm not denying the possibility, but usually a person is influenced by the company they hang around. So if you're with murderers and rapists and child molesters, you tend to kind of gravitate in that particular direction. So the Ohr Miklat is a very, very interesting example, albeit an isolated example, of a certain, what you might call, theory of penology, in which the Torah says when you have to take a person away from society, you put him in an environment of holiness and goodness rather than an environment of evildoers and the like. This is a thought of Lubavitcher Rebbe. Okay. Be it as it may, though, this notion that he remains in the prison, in the Ohr Miklat, until the Kohen Gadol dies. So because of this, the Mishnah says that the mothers of the Kohen Gadols, Kohanim Gadolim, used to bring care packages, used to bring food packages to the inhabitants of the Ohr Miklat, in order that the inhabitants of the Ohr Miklat should not pray that the Kohen Gadol died. Because if you're a Rotzeach, the one thing you would like is you would like the Kohen Gadol to die so you could go free. So the mothers of the Kohen Gadols were afraid of this prayer, so they would go and they would bribe the Rotzchim by giving them gifts in order that the Rotzchim would not pray that their son would die. So the Gemara in Makkas asks a kasha. The implication would be that if the Rotzchim were to pray that the Kohen Gadol should die, the prayer might be answered. Because if they're afraid, we got to stop these guys from praying, so we'll bribe them, that's mashma that there's some reason to be afraid of the efficacy of the prayer. The Gemara says, why should that be so? If the Kohen Gadol is not guilty of any sin, if I pray that somebody should die, why should the prayer be effective if the Kohen Gadol is in fact innocent of any wrongdoing? So here's what the Gemara says. The Gemara says, the Kohen Gadol is not innocent of any wrongdoing. He should have prayed, because since the Kohen Gadol is supposed to be the spiritual leader of the generation, he should have prayed that these homicides should not occur. And if the homicides did occur, it's because he either didn't pray or he didn't pray with enough kavana. He didn't care enough. And because he did not care enough, he is considered responsible for what happened. And that makes him vulnerable to the prayers of the Rotzchim, who would otherwise, and that prayer might have been effective, and that's why the Rotzchim needed to be placated by these food packages. I'll discuss how that works in a moment. In other words, what is the Gemara saying? The Kohen Gadol could have prayed that these tragedies do not occur. Yeah.
Why does this particular type of prayer have a special rule? Like usually, say someone's praying, have kids, or the parents don't die or something, we're not like, oh, well, you just didn't pray with enough kavana. You know, like sometimes it's just what Hashem wants to happen. Like, why does this have a special situation where we assume that the Kohen Gadol didn't pray with enough kavana?
So, yeah, it's a very good point. So I think the answer might be that we're not asserting it to be a certainty, but it is a possibility, meaning the mothers are afraid that Hashem will hold their children accountable for not doing enough. Now, you're right. Maybe they did do enough, and Hashem decided that was not enough. But in terms of the mother's perspective, since there is a basis to hold them culpable. So, let's think about this a little bit. So, the Gemara is establishing the proposition, is it not, that the Kohen Gadol could have prayed that these homicides not take place. Now, if you think about that, that itself is an interference with free will. Because given the fact that the homicides are not an accident like an earthquake or a tsunami, but the homicides come from, I'm a careless person. I don't look both ways at an intersection. I don't stop at a red light. I don't, look out the window. So the Kohen Gadol can pray that I should be more careful. The Kohen Gadol should pray that I should have more of a regard. In other words, isn't that an example, is it not, of tefillah, like the Chazon Ish, that tefillah, you're praying to God, please make people more careful. Please make people look both ways. Please make drivers stop at red lights. L'chaira, that itself is a bechira decision, how careful I choose to be, and yet the Kohen Gadol is held accountable for not stopping that. Now, you could learn that, no, the Kohen Gadol is not praying that you should stop at a red light. The Kohen Gadol is not praying you should be a more careful driver. The Kohen Gadol is not praying that you should look out the window. That's up to you. But the Kohen Gadol can pray that the kid, when you go through the red light, there shouldn't be a kid there. Meaning to say, it goes back to the circumstances. The Kohen Gadol can still pray, I can't control your bad choices. But I pray to Hashem that the victims be protected and not be in that bad place. So you don't have a raya necessarily, meaning the Gemara does not mean that the Kohen Gadol overrides the bechira choices that people make, but rather that they shouldn't be efficacious in the sense of harming the victims that they harm. By the way, again, it's not really our subject, but just to complete the inyan, I had mentioned that there are 48 Orei Miklat. So you might ask me, Akasha, doesn't the Torah say there are 6 Orei Miklat? There are 3 on the western part of the Yarden, and there are 3 Aver Yarden. So how do I get 48? So the Gemara in Makkas explains, just what the Gemara says, that there are in fact 48 Orei Miklat, but 6 of them are called primary cities, and the 42 of them, the 42 remainder, are called secondary cities. What's the nafkamina between the 6 primary and the 42 secondary? So the Gemara explains the 6 primary offer protection even if the Rotseach does not even know he's in an Ohr Miklat. Let's assume that he's drunk, he wandered into a city, he doesn't even know where he is. Actually, he doesn't have to be drunk, he just doesn't know where he is. And the Goel Adam kills him. In the 6 cities, he is protected, meaning the Goel Adam is Chayev Misa, even if he was not aware that he was in an Ohr Miklat. In the 42 cities, he is only protected if he knows. Now, how do you prove that? That's anyone's guess. I have no idea exactly how you're going to establish it. But it does mean, interesting notion of trickery here. If I'm a Rotseach, right? I'm just making up a case. A Gael Adam, rather. I'm a Gael Adam. I encounter the Rotseach in one of the 42 cities. I pull out my gun, which, by the way, you're not allowed to bring weapons into the Ohr Miklat, but I somehow got through. I got through the metal detector. I pull out my gun. So the Goel Adam, the Rotseach says to me, you better not shoot me. I am protected. I'm in an Ohr Miklat. And I convince him, no, you're not. You got the wrong city here. Ohr Miklat is 1 mile down the road. You're not in the Ohr Miklat. And somehow I convince the Rotseach he's not in the Ohr Miklat. And then I shoot him. Again, how you prove it, I don't know. I'm off the hook. I can actually trick him into not knowing he's in the Ohr Miklat, and then I'm potter. But in the other 6, in the primary 6, you can't do that. Now, the Gemara in Makkas asks a very fascinating kasha. L'chaira, let's look at the primary 6 for a moment. L'chaira, the primary 6 are not distributed in a logical way, because on the west bank of the Yarden, how many tribes are living there? You have 9.5 tribes, half of Menashe. So 6 Orei Miklat are servicing a population of 9.5 tribes. On the east of the Yarden, which only has 2.5 tribes, you have the same 3 cities. Meaning to say, apparently, there is many, so to speak, per person, per capita. There are more Orei Miklat, so to speak, on east of the Yarden than west of the Yarden. Right? If you need 3 cities for 2.5 tribes, then for 9 tribes, you should have 3 times the Orei Miklat. Now I'm thinking, the truth of the matter is I have a kasha on the Gemara itself, because given the fact that we do count the Orei Leviim as at least secondary Orei Miklat, so the truth is the vast majority of the Orei Leviim are west of the Yarden. So the answer might be Pashut. We have the other cities. I mean, why are you only asking the kasha based on the 6 cities and you don't consider the 48 cities, the vast majority of which is located to the west? I mean, that's a kasha on the Gemara itself. But the Gemara, just looking at the 6, says, if you need 3 cities for 2.5 tribes, then how can 3 cities be enough for 9.5 tribes? So the Gemara's answer is, in Aver Yarden, east of the Yarden, the murder rate is much higher. The murder rate is higher. It's like South Bronx or whatever it would be, or Patterson, New Jersey. Very dangerous place. There's Yeshivat in Patterson for some reason. Patterson, New Jersey is a real crime capital in New Jersey. Really, really, really dangerous. And that's why you actually need proportionally more Orei Miklat, because there'll be more Rotzchim that come. So here's an interesting question. L'chaira, when you say there's a lot of murderers, these are people who murder on purpose. So why would that increase the Ir Miklat population? Why would a high crime area have more accidental homicides? You see, what's the correlation? So you actually see a very, very interesting Musar idea, and that is sin corrupts the environment. It debases the environment, meaning to say, when you have intentional murderers, life is devalued, and people will stop looking at red lights, and they'll stopping at an intersection, meaning Averos pull society down. So yes, if there's a lot of murders in my community, I'm not going to be a murderer, usually. I'm not going to be a murderer. But I may pay less attention at the intersection because the atmosphere drags me down. Right? We get influenced by the averos that are done even by others. In fact, that creates our obligation. Sometimes a person says, if I want to go to hell, that's my business. What do you care? Well, number one, we have to care because we have to care about every Jew. But number two, when a person wants to go to hell, he's not just dragging himself down. He's going to drag a whole bunch of other people down with him because we all get influenced. It's the famous mashal of the Talmud Yerushalmi. You're sitting on a boat, and there's a hole in the boat under your seat, and water is coming in, and it's going to sink the boat. And when somebody wants to fix the hole, you say to them, this is the Yerushalmi, get out of here, it's under my seat, it's none of your business. But the response to that is, well, if the hole is not repaired under your seat, the whole ship is going to sink. So it does become our business. And this you see from the Gemara, an increase in the intentional murder rate is going to create an increase in the accidental murder rate because people will care less about life. In fact, the Beis Halevi says it's not only people that get dragged down, it's even animals. By the Mabul, it says, Hishchis kol basar estarko ala oretz. All of flesh was corrupted, and that refers to the idea of even animals were mating with different species. Like, whatever it is, the cow went to the goat or whatever it would be. And therefore Hashem had to destroy the world because it was so corrupt. Now the Beis Halevi says, what does that mean? I mean, animals don't have bechira, they act under instinct. In what way would an animal make a decision all of a sudden to go to a goat or whatever it would be? The Beis Halevi says this was not a matter of choice, but given the fact that the world was corrupt with incest and homosexuality, these were some of the sins of the Dor HaMabul. So that creates a ruach of tuma in the world, and that ruach of tuma will even be makalkel animals, which is actually quite interesting because, not that this topic may not interest you that much, that doesn't interest me that much, but there's a little bit of a discussion in the literature about discovering gay animals. In other words, there are a percentage of animals that are actually homosexual, and this was not noticed before. Now, maybe it wasn't noticed before, but another possibility would be exactly what the Beis Halevi is talking about, that as something becomes more tolerated and more accepted among human people who make choices, it even has an effect on the animal kingdom itself, because the very air, the very atmosphere changes and drags even the animals down. Yeah.
I understand what you're saying about negligence, how if you live in an environment that's bad, you might be more likely to be more negligent, or that might be the norm.
Yeah.
But how exactly do we measure negligence? Because I think it's whatever deviates from what a reasonable person would do. But if you're in a negligent place, then surely your level of cautiousness also needs to go up when you cross the road. For instance, like in Australia, whenever the intersection's the green man says we can go, there's no cars that still try to go for it. Whereas in Israel, happening all the time, there's still Israeli drivers that will try and cross the corner. So maybe Israel, in that example, there's more negligence here, but on the other hand, the environment's not necessarily more.
Well, yeah, you're making a good point, because essentially it cuts in two directions. When I live in a more negligent society, so one aspect means I have to be more vigilant because I'm exposed to bad drivers and everything else. So that could have the effect of making me more careful. On the other hand, it can also have the effect of you go along with the crowd and do what everybody else does, and it can drag you down. I think what normally happens is you'll be more vigilant about yourself and less concerned about others. That's what's going to happen, meaning I'm not going to put myself in danger, but I'm not necessarily going to pay attention to what's happening to other people. Yeah.
Could another possible reason why there was a bigger amount of accidental murder in a place where there was a lot of actual murders is that people just lie?
Yeah, well, it is, actually one possibility the Rishonim themselves say is that according to the halacha, every murderer, whether it's shogeg or mezid, initially has to go to the Yer Miklat and then is taken to the Beis Din, which decides if you're a shogeg or mezid. So initially, even the intentional murderers are going to be sent to the Yer Miklat, and you're adding that maybe they're lying. Also, let me mention yet another possibility, and that is the Gemara says that sometimes Hashem orchestrates unintentional murder in order to punish the intentional guy who was not caught by witnesses. In other words, an example would be, let's say Reuven intentionally murders Shimon, and he's chayav misa. But what happens is that there are no witnesses, etc. So Hashem is going to cause Reuven to be under Shimon's ladder, or whatever it is, so Shimon will kill Reuven. So that actually means the more intentional murders you have, the more Hashem has to cause unintentional deaths in order to punish the murderers who didn't get caught by the Beis Din system. Right? So there are other reasons. I'm not saying this is the only reason. But one reason is indeed the idea that a Ruach HaTumah is created by Averos.
But if they say that a murderous Beis Din was one that would murder more than once every 7 years, so it must have been directly proportionate by almost double.
Yeah, it's true. But on the other hand, the Mishnah itself is a machlokas. You'll remember that one opinion says every 7 years, one opinion says 70 years. Rabbi Akiva said if I would have been on the Sanhedrin, nobody would get killed because I'd always find a way out. And then on the other hand, we have a Tana that says that your attitude would be marbeh shofchei damim. You're encouraging murders because people know they're not going to get punished. So they took the position it's better to be more proactive, right? So apparently there was a big machlokas whether capital punishment was a good thing or capital punishment was a bad thing. Actually, it mirrors the contemporary debates about capital punishment. Chazal were debating whether we should try to do it less or try to do it more. Yeah.
They're suggesting that there are possibly more negligent homicides on the other side of the Jordan because there's less Kedusha. And if that's the case, is there proof today that people who live in the Golan are more likely to commit per capita, more likely to commit homicide?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. The one thing the Gemara does not address is why. Why it was there more murder east of the Jordan, right? It just makes the statement, and it quotes a pasuk, and it does not give any reason. The simplest reason would indeed be because east of the Jordan has less of a holiness, although halachically it is part of Eretz Yisrael, but it has less holiness than the west, the so-called West Bank, and as a result, people are nimshach to Averos. Another possibility is closer proximity to the non-Jewish nations who live there. Now, does that translate into Golan today? As far as I know, well, depends how you define criminal activity, but generally speaking, I believe that the Jews of the Golan are as righteous as the Jews of any part of Eretz Yisrael, so it doesn't necessarily carry over today. Yeah.
So, going back to the idea about the Kohanim Gedolim being able to daven that when the Rotzeichim act negligibly, the child could not be crossing the road at that moment.
Yeah.
When we talk about the Rotzeichim davening for the Kohen Gadol to die,
Yes.
that seems like a support for the Chazon Ish. But could it be that the only thing that they're able to daven for is that for example, when the Kohen Gedolim are crossing the road, that a car should come at that moment, whereas beforehand he would have crossed and that car wouldn't have been there?
So you're saying that it's not a direct prayer that he should die, but that he should be in a place. Yeah, it could be. You can continue the same idea there. Yeah. By the way, one final point about this. So what emerges from the Gemara with all of our explanations is that the Kohen Gadol could somehow have stopped these bad things in one way or the other. Therefore, he's vulnerable. Therefore, the mothers had to bring the care packages so they wouldn't pray. So the question is, hey, if I want to get out of the Yer Miklat and I want to pray that the Kohen Gadol dies, I'm going to be placated with chocolate chip cookies? I mean, what's going to be? I mean, I'm not going to pray because she brought me cookies? What's going on? It may depend how good the cookies are. I don't know. So the Mefarshim say, of course they're going to pray. That's not going to stop them from praying. But their prayer is not going to be 100% Belev Shalom. They're going to think, that nice old lady, the gray hair, brought me this delicious cake. I kind of feel bad praying. So it's not that they're going to stop their prayer, but their prayer is not going to be with the fullness of kavanah, and therefore it'll be less effective. So you see how important kavanah is. That kavanah can really make the big difference, and even a marginal little reduction of kavanah due to the chocolate chip cookies is enough already to make the prayer ineffective. So it's not that they're not going to pray, but it's no longer going to be at the 100% intensity that it otherwise would be. Yeah.
Do we know anything about how it logistically worked? Like for every city, how did the mother get the list of all the roads?
Oh yeah, that is an interesting question. That is an interesting question because you do have 48 cities, right? And every single guy in that city is going to be there till the Kohen Gadol dies. I don't know. It's a very good question. Maybe they had a committee. It's not that every woman personally visited, but they had committees of women. In other words, relatives of the Kohen Gadol, friends of the mother, etc., who would go out. The mother would organize a committee, like a Bikur Cholim committee or whatever, to do it. But that's interesting. There's a lot of, think about the logistics. It's hard to know how it worked. Yeah.
And also, were there any exceptions to where a person could leave the city? Like, for example, if he saw like the new moon or something?
Yeah. So actually, the Rambam writes beferish that a Rotzeach cannot leave the city even if all of Am Yisrael needs even if he could save all, even for Pikuach Nefesh of Am Yisrael and the like. And in your particular case, there would be no, basically, well, I don't know how they would know. The Sanhedrin could go to the Yer Miklat and be Makabel Eidos, but they don't know that the guy saw. But in such a situation, he's not allowed to leave. There is literally no exception at all. He cannot leave the Yer Miklat for anything, which means he didn't bring the Korban Pesach. He didn't bring any of these things. There is no exception for him leaving the city. Okay.